The crowd laughed when the CEO pointed at the rust-covered car sitting in a single dad's backyard and called it junk. But what happened over the next few weeks would leave an entire racetrack too stunned to speak. On a warm Saturday afternoon just outside Bozeman, Montana, sunlight spilled across acres of dry grass and weathered fence posts. The air smelled faintly of motor oil, cut hay, and the promise of summer. Beyond the paved roads and luxury dealerships, beyond the polished offices where executives made decisions worth millions of dollars, there was a small property tucked against the rolling hills. It wasn't much to look at. The white paint on the house had faded years ago. The porch sagged slightly on one side. A wooden swing creaked whenever the wind pushed against it. Yet somehow the place carried a quiet dignity, the kind that came from years of honest work and sacrifice. Behind the house stood a garage that had seen better days. Its doors were scratched and dented, and one window had been patched with clear plastic. Inside, surrounded by toolboxes, spare parts, and old photographs, Ethan Walker wiped grease from his hands and looked at a car most people would have hauled away years ago. Its paint was uneven. Rust clung stubbornly to sections of the body. The hood showed scars from countless repairs. To strangers, it looked like scrap metal waiting for its final trip to the junkyard. But Ethan never looked at it that way. Neither did his 11-year-old daughter. "Dad," Sophie called as she stepped into the garage carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "You've been working on it all morning." Ethan smiled and accepted one of the glasses. "Some things take time." Sophie glanced at the old car. Her blue eyes reflected the afternoon light. "Do you think people will ever understand what you're doing?" Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "They don't need to." Sophie nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. In many ways, she was the only person who truly understood him. Life had taught Ethan not to chase attention. Years earlier, loss had reshaped everything. Dreams had changed. Priorities had shifted. These days, his world revolved around 2 things: providing for his daughter and keeping his promises. The old car somehow belonged to both. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, a convoy of luxury vehicles rolled into town. Their polished exteriors reflected the Montana sun like mirrors. Cameras followed them. Reporters followed them. Attention followed them. At the center of it all was Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Motors. At 38, she had built a reputation as one of the most powerful automotive executives in America. Investors admired her. Competitors feared her. Headlines followed her wherever she went. She was brilliant, disciplined, and rarely impressed. This weekend, she had come to Montana to announce a racing event unlike anything the region had ever seen. The winner would walk away with $6 million. Drivers from across the country were already arriving. Engineers, sponsors, influencers, and journalists crowded hotels and restaurants. Excitement buzzed through the entire county. Everyone wanted to witness history. 2 days later, Victoria toured several local garages as part of a media event. Cameras documented every stop. Crowds gathered behind temporary barriers. Then someone mentioned a local mechanic who had been rebuilding an old race car in his backyard. Curious reporters suggested they take a look. Victoria agreed. Minutes later, dozens of people found themselves standing outside Ethan Walker's garage. Ethan emerged from beneath the hood of the old car, surprised by the sudden attention. Sophie stood beside him, clutching a wrench almost as long as her forearm. Victoria studied the vehicle for several seconds. Her perfectly composed expression barely changed. Then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who believed she had already seen the ending. "That," she said, gesturing toward the battered machine, "might be the most ambitious pile of scrap metal I've ever seen." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Several reporters chuckled. A few spectators shook their heads. Sophie's face tightened. Ethan simply looked at the car. He said nothing. The laughter grew louder. But somewhere beneath the noise, hidden beneath years of silence and sacrifice, something else was beginning to move. The laughter lingered long after the cameras stopped recording. Some people replayed the clip before they even left Ethan's property. Others uploaded it online before sunset. By morning, thousands had already seen the moment. The powerful CEO standing beside a rusted old car. The struggling single father staring quietly at the ground. The crowd laughing. It was exactly the kind of story the internet loved. What nobody cared about was what happened after everyone left. The evening air settled gently across the property as golden light faded behind the Montana hills. The garage stood silent once again. No reporters, no executives, no spectators. Just Ethan, Sophie, and the old machine that seemed to carry more history than either of them ever talked about. Sophie sat on a wooden stool near the workbench, turning a socket wrench slowly between her fingers. She had been unusually quiet all evening. Ethan noticed it immediately. "You are thinking pretty hard over there," he said softly while tightening a bolt beneath the hood. Sophie shrugged. "I just do not understand why people have to be mean." Ethan paused for a moment. The fluorescent light above them hummed softly. "Most of the time, people are not trying to be mean." Sophie looked unconvinced. "She laughed at you." Ethan closed the toolbox and sat beside her. Outside, crickets had begun their nightly song. Sometimes people laugh at things they do not understand. Sophie lowered her eyes. "Does it bother you?" Ethan thought carefully before answering. "It used to." Sophie studied his face. There was no anger there. No bitterness. Only a quiet calm that seemed stronger than either. She had seen that look before. It always appeared whenever life became difficult. "I still think she was wrong," Sophie whispered. Ethan smiled. "Maybe." The next morning, the entire town seemed obsessed with the upcoming race. Posters appeared in store windows. Radio stations discussed favorites and betting odds. Expensive race teams rolled into Montana from California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Massive trailers parked near the speedway. Mechanics unloaded equipment worth more than some houses. Everywhere people talked about engines, sponsors, and prize money. $6 million. The number felt almost unreal. For some drivers, it represented glory. For others, opportunity. For Ethan, it represented something he never discussed out loud. Across town, Victoria Sterling stood inside a private conference room overlooking the race facility. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the track below. Executives moved around her carrying tablets and schedules. Everything was running exactly as planned. "The promotional numbers are already exceeding expectations," one executive reported. "The clip from yesterday generated millions of impressions." Victoria nodded. "People enjoy a good underdog story." The executive hesitated. "Do you think that mechanic actually plans to race?" Victoria glanced toward the track. "Everyone plans to race. Very few are prepared to win." The conversation moved on. Yet for reasons she could not explain, her thoughts briefly returned to Ethan Walker. Not because of his car. Certainly not because of his chances. It was something else. Something about the way he had not defended himself. Most people argued when embarrassed. Most people tried to prove something. Ethan had simply remained silent. Back at the garage, Ethan continued working late into the night. Hours passed unnoticed. Wrenches clicked. Metal shifted. Tools scraped against steel. Piece by piece, the old vehicle slowly transformed. Sophie often stayed nearby doing homework at a folding table. Occasionally she would glance up and watch him work. He moved with a confidence that seemed almost effortless. Every adjustment appeared deliberate. Every decision carried purpose. One evening she finally asked the question she had been holding inside for days. "Dad." Ethan looked up. "Yeah. Why do you care so much about this car?" The garage grew quiet. For several seconds, only the ticking of cooling metal filled the air. Ethan's eyes settled on the vehicle. A distant look crossed his face. Not sadness. Not regret. Something deeper. Something older. "Because some promises take longer to keep than others," he said. Sophie waited for more. None came. Ethan returned to his work. Yet as the wrench turned in his hand, memories seemed to move behind his eyes like shadows passing across an old road. Whatever story connected him to that car had started long before Montana. Long before the garage. Long before anyone had ever heard Victoria Sterling's laughter. The closer race day came, the more impossible Ethan Walker's dream seemed. Every morning brought another reminder of the gap between his world and everyone else's. Massive transport trucks rolled into the speedway carrying race cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Corporate banners stretched across fences. Sponsors hosted media events beneath white tents large enough to shelter entire neighborhoods. Television crews walked the grounds searching for stories. Everywhere people looked, money seemed to flow as naturally as the wind across the Montana plains. Yet every evening, when the sun slipped behind the mountains and shadows stretched across the valley, Ethan returned to the same weathered garage behind his modest home. The old car waited patiently beneath the fluorescent lights. It never complained. It never demanded attention. It simply sat there, as if trusting him to finish what had been started long ago. One afternoon, Sophie rode her bicycle into town to pick up supplies from the hardware store. As she entered the main street, she noticed a crowd gathered outside a sporting goods shop. Several televisions in the display window were replaying interviews from the upcoming race. Curious, she stopped. On the screen stood Blake Harrington, the defending champion and the favorite to win the $6 million prize. He looked confident standing beside a gleaming race machine surrounded by cameras. A reporter smiled. "Any concerns about unexpected competition this year?" Blake laughed. "The only competition I am worried about comes from professionals." The crowd chuckled. "What about the local mechanic everyone has been talking about?" another reporter asked. Blake grinned even wider. "You mean the backyard car? If that thing makes it around one lap, I will be impressed." More laughter followed. Sophie lowered her eyes and quietly rode away. The word stayed with her all afternoon. Later that evening, she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the horizon orange and gold. Ethan eventually joined her carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. The air had turned cooler. Autumn seemed to be arriving early. Sophie stared toward the distant hills. "Everyone thinks you are going to lose." Ethan sat beside her. "Probably." She frowned. "That does not bother you." He took a slow sip before answering. "Winning respect by proving people wrong is temporary." Sophie looked confused. Ethan smiled gently. "Earning respect from yourself lasts longer." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. It was the kind of quiet evening that made the world feel smaller and somehow safer. Then Sophie's voice broke the silence. "What if I believe you can win?" Ethan turned toward her. Her eyes carried absolute certainty. No hesitation. No doubt. The kind of belief only a child can give. Ethan looked away for a second. Something moved behind his calm expression. "Then I am already luckier than most people." The next day brought an unexpected challenge. Every vehicle entered in the competition had to pass an official inspection before qualifying. Hundreds gathered at the speedway as race teams lined up beneath inspection tents. Mechanics moved quickly between engines and computers. Judges checked specifications with practiced efficiency. Ethan arrived alone. The old car rolled forward slowly among machines that looked as if they belonged in another world. Conversations stopped as people noticed him. Some recognized him from the viral video. Others simply recognized the car. Whispers spread through the crowd. A few smiles appeared. Some amused. Some sympathetic. Others openly dismissive. Ethan remained focused. When his turn finally arrived, officials began examining the vehicle. One inspector circled it twice. Another checked measurements. A third reviewed documentation. Their expressions gradually shifted from amusement to curiosity. They exchanged brief glances, but said very little. Nearby reporters noticed the change immediately. Cameras started pointing in Ethan's direction. Across the inspection area, Victoria Sterling happened to be walking between sponsor meetings when she saw the small crowd forming. She paused. Something about the scene drew her attention. At first, she expected another joke. Another opportunity for spectators to laugh at the local mechanic. Instead, she noticed something unusual. The inspectors were no longer smiling. They were studying the vehicle carefully. One even bent down to examine part of the chassis a second time. Victoria narrowed her eyes. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she found herself genuinely curious. Not impressed. Not concerned. Just curious. And sometimes curiosity is the first crack that appears before certainty begins to break. Victoria remained where she was long after the inspectors moved on to the next vehicle. Around her, the speedway buzzed with its usual energy. Engines roared in the distance. Announcers tested microphones. Teams rushed between trailers carrying equipment and laptops. Yet her attention kept drifting back toward the weathered car that should have been easy to dismiss. One of the senior inspectors approached her moments later. "Everything all right?" she asked casually. The man nodded. "Perfectly legal." "That is not what I asked." The inspector hesitated. "No, I suppose it is not." Victoria folded her arms. "Then what caught your attention?" The inspector glanced across the paddock before lowering his voice. "The craftsmanship." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "On that car? Especially on that car?" Before she could ask another question, he excused himself and disappeared into the crowd. The answer left her strangely unsettled. Not because she suddenly believed Ethan was a threat. She did not. But certainty had become curiosity, and curiosity had become a question she could not easily ignore. Meanwhile, Ethan loaded the car back onto its trailer and headed home. Sophie practically bounced with excitement during the drive. "Did you see their faces?" she asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Whose faces?" "The inspector's." Ethan smiled faintly. "I saw them. They looked surprised." "Maybe." Sophie laughed. "Dad, you always do that." "Do what?" "Answer without answering." Ethan chuckled softly. Outside the truck window, golden fields stretched toward the horizon. The late afternoon sun painted everything with warm light. For a moment, life felt simple again. But later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan remained alone in the garage. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily. Midnight approached. The rest of the world slept. Ethan did not. He stood beside the car holding a faded photograph. The edges had curled with age. The image showed a younger version of himself standing beside another vehicle many years earlier. The smile on his face was different then, less guarded, less tired. He studied the photograph for several seconds before returning it carefully to a small metal box hidden inside a cabinet. The box contained only a few possessions: old papers, a racing badge, several photographs, and a folded letter he had not opened in years. Ethan stared at the box before shutting the cabinet door. Some memories carried weight. Others carried promises. The following morning, qualifying day arrived. The speedway filled before sunrise. Spectators packed grandstands. Vendors opened food stands. Television crews prepared live broadcasts. Excitement hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Every driver would have one opportunity to post a qualifying time, one chance to prove they belonged. As teams prepared their vehicles, reporters searched for stories. Most gravitated toward famous names and expensive machinery. Yet one reporter found herself walking toward Ethan's pit area instead. Her name was Rachel Bennett, a local journalist who had covered racing for nearly a decade. Unlike many others, she was less interested in spectacle and more interested in people. She approached cautiously. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan looked up from adjusting a panel beneath the hood. "Yes. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Ethan glanced at the camera crew standing behind her. He seemed uncomfortable immediately. Rachel noticed. "Nothing complicated," she assured him. After a brief pause, Ethan nodded. Rachel smiled. "Why enter a race like this?" Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "Because I had a reason." $6 million? Rachel asked. Ethan shook his head. "No." Rachel blinked. "Most people would say yes." Ethan smiled politely. "Most people are probably smarter than me." The small crew laughed. Rachel continued. "Then why?" Ethan looked toward the grandstands where thousands of spectators filled the seats. Somewhere among them sat Sophie, proudly wearing a faded baseball cap with grease stains from the garage. His expression softened. Some things matter more than money. Rachel followed his gaze, but asked no further questions. She sensed there was a story beneath the answer. A deeper one, the kind that could not be rushed. Across the paddock, Victoria happened to catch part of the interview on a nearby monitor. She watched silently. Most drivers loved attention. Most sponsors demanded it. Yet Ethan seemed almost allergic to it. The contradiction made no sense. And people who made no sense tended to stay in her mind longer than they should. Minutes later, engines began starting throughout the facility. Deep mechanical growls echoed across the track. Qualifying was about to begin. Drivers climbed into cockpits. Officials took positions. Spectators leaned forward with anticipation. Ethan settled into his seat and wrapped both hands around the steering wheel. For a moment he closed his eyes. The noise around him faded. The crowd disappeared. The pressure vanished. There was only silence. Then a memory surfaced. Not a full memory, just a voice. A promise. A moment from long ago. His eyes opened again. Calm returned to his face. Whatever history connected him to this machine remained hidden beneath years of quiet sacrifice. But as the first qualifying engines rolled toward the track, it became clear that the past was slowly catching up with him. The first qualifying runs began beneath a bright Montana sky. One by one, the professional teams took their turns. Expensive engines screamed down the straightaways. Crowds cheered as digital scoreboards flashed impressive lap times. Every performance seemed designed to remind spectators why these drivers were considered the best in the country. Blake Harrington lived up to every expectation. His car flew around the circuit with smooth precision. When his time appeared on the giant screen, the grandstands erupted. Reporters immediately rushed toward his pit area. Cameras followed his confident smile. Sponsors congratulated him. Everything looked exactly as the experts had predicted. Then Ethan's turn arrived. The atmosphere shifted in a different way. Not excitement. Not anticipation. Something closer to curiosity mixed with doubt. Spectators leaned forward. Some raised their phones. Others exchanged amused looks. Across the speedway, conversation slowed. The old car rolled toward the starting line carrying years of rust, repairs, and unanswered questions. Sophie watched from the stands, her hands clasped tightly together. Beside her sat Rachel Bennett. The journalist had quietly purchased a ticket near the grandstand rather than remain with the media crews. She was no longer interested only in the race. She was interested in Ethan Walker. Nervous? Rachel asked. Sophie nodded honestly. A little. Do you think he can do it? Sophie never hesitated. Yes. Rachel smiled. That confident. Sophie looked toward the track. Everybody sees the car. She paused. I see my dad. Rachel found herself unable to argue with that. Down below, Ethan waited inside the cockpit. The steering wheel felt familiar beneath his hands. The scent of metal, rubber, and fuel surrounded him. Around him, thousands of voices blended into distant noise. Yet his thoughts drifted somewhere quieter, somewhere far away from the speedway. He remembered long nights in the garage, empty savings accounts, repairs that took longer than expected, promises made when nobody else was listening. The official raised a green flag. Ethan opened his eyes. The moment had arrived. The car moved forward. At first, nothing extraordinary happened. The vehicle accelerated steadily down the straightaway. Some spectators even looked disappointed. The old machine did not roar dramatically. It did not produce smoke or spectacle. It simply moved with calm purpose. Then the first corner arrived. Several experienced racing fans in the crowd suddenly sat upright. A few mechanics watching from pit lane narrowed their eyes. Something about the way the car carried speed through the turn felt unusual. Subtle. Difficult to explain. Yet impossible to ignore. The second sector produced the same reaction. Then the third. Conversations gradually faded. Laughter disappeared. People who expected a disaster found themselves paying closer attention. Rachel glanced around and noticed it immediately. Nobody was making jokes anymore. They were watching. Blake Harrington noticed as well. Standing near his pit crew, he folded his arms while monitoring the timing screens. At first he looked amused, then slightly confused, then focused. Numbers continued updating. Ethan's lap was not dominating the field. Not yet, but it was far better than anyone had predicted. Far better than it had any right to be. In the VIP viewing area, Victoria Sterling stepped closer to the glass overlooking the track. One of her executives spoke beside her, but she barely heard him. Her attention remained fixed on the scoreboard. Interesting, she murmured. The executive followed her gaze. You think he got lucky? Victoria remained silent. Luck explained one corner. Maybe two. It did not explain consistency. The lap ended. Ethan crossed the line. The scoreboard updated. For a brief moment, nobody reacted. The crowd seemed to need several seconds to process what they were seeing. Then a low murmur spread across the speedway. Ethan had qualified. Not near the bottom. Not barely surviving. He had posted a time strong enough to advance comfortably into the next stage. Sophie jumped to her feet. Relief flooded her face. Rachel laughed softly beside her. Around them, spectators checked screens and compared results. The surprise was real. Yet Ethan's reaction could not have been more different. He simply guided the car back toward the pit area and climbed out. No celebration. No triumphant gesture. No attempt to prove anyone wrong. He looked almost exactly as he had before the lap began. Calm. Quiet. Unmoved. As if qualifying had never been the goal. That calm unsettled Victoria more than the lap itself. Most competitors revealed something when pressure arrived. Pride. Fear. Ego. Desperation. Ethan revealed almost nothing. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the speedway, more than one person began to wonder whether the greatest mystery was not the car at all. It was the man behind the wheel. By the end of qualifying day, the speedway no longer viewed Ethan Walker as a joke. The laughter had faded, but respect had not fully arrived either. What remained was uncertainty. People were no longer asking whether he belonged there. They were asking who he really was. The answer seemed hidden behind every calm smile and every quiet response he gave. Throughout the evening, reporters searched for information. They spoke with local mechanics. They interviewed neighbors. They scanned public records. Yet the deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. Ethan appeared ordinary, almost painfully ordinary. He paid his bills, fixed cars, raised his daughter, helped neighbors when they needed a hand. There were no trophies displayed in his garage, no public achievements, no headlines connected to his name. It was as if an entire chapter of his life had simply disappeared. Meanwhile, inside one of the luxury hospitality suites overlooking the track, Victoria Sterling stood alone near the window. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Far below, teams continued preparing for the next round. Her assistant entered carrying a tablet. "You asked for information on Ethan Walker." Victoria accepted the device. And not much to find. Everyone leaves a trail. Apparently not everyone. Victoria reviewed the report. Employment history, property records, volunteer work, local references. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Yet something about the absence of information bothered her more than any discovery would have. She looked back toward the speedway. "Keep looking." Her assistant nodded and left. Victoria remained by the glass. For the first time in years, she found herself distracted by someone she could not figure out. Across town, Ethan and Sophie were finishing dinner in their small kitchen. The meal was simple: grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, corn from a nearby farm. Nothing fancy. Yet after weeks of pressure, the normalcy felt comforting. Sophie could barely contain her excitement. "You should have seen Blake's face after qualifying." Ethan smiled. "I was a little busy driving." He looked worried. Maybe he was thinking about something else. Sophie laughed. "Dad." Ethan laughed with her. The sound filled the room briefly before quiet settled again. Sophie studied him carefully. "You are nervous about tomorrow." Ethan paused. "What makes you think that?" "You keep staring at your coffee." Ethan looked down at the untouched mug sitting in front of him. Sophie grinned triumphantly. "See?" He shook his head, amused. "You notice too much. I learned from you." The answer caught him off guard. For a moment, his smile softened. The truth was that she was right. He was nervous. Not because of the competition. Not because of the money. Tomorrow represented something deeper. Something connected to promises he had carried for years. Promises that seemed heavier the closer he came to fulfilling them. Later that night, Sophie fell asleep quickly. Ethan did not. He returned to the garage as he always did when life became complicated. The familiar scent of metal and oil greeted him. Moonlight slipped through the small window above the workbench. The old car rested quietly beneath the shadows. Ethan walked around it slowly. His hand brushed against the roof. Every panel, every component, every repair told a story. Some stories belonged to the machine. Others belonged to him. Near midnight, he opened the cabinet once more and removed the small metal box. This time he unfolded the old letter. The paper had yellowed with age. Creases marked the places where it had been opened countless times before. He read silently. The words seemed to carry him somewhere far away. A faint smile appeared, then sadness, then determination. By the time he folded the letter again, his eyes reflected a decision already made long ago. The following morning arrived cold and clear. Thin layers of mist drifted across the fields surrounding the speedway. Spectators filled the gates earlier than before. News coverage had intensified overnight. Ethan's qualifying performance had become one of the biggest stories of the event. Some called him a dark horse. Others called him lucky. A few insisted the next round would expose him completely. Yet despite all the opinions, nobody truly knew what would happen. Rachel Bennett arrived before sunrise and found herself standing near Ethan's pit area once again. This time she noticed something she had missed before. Hanging inside the garage trailer was a faded photograph partially visible beneath a stack of supplies. The image appeared old. In it stood a younger Ethan beside another person whose face was mostly hidden by a fold in the photograph. Rachel could not see much, but one detail caught her attention immediately. The younger Ethan looked remarkably different. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence in his posture seemed impossible to ignore. Before she could study it further, Ethan entered the trailer and gently turned the photograph face down. Their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke, yet something passed between them. An understanding that certain stories are not shared until they are ready. Outside, engines began firing to life across the paddock. The sound rolled through the morning air like distant thunder. The next stage of the competition was about to begin. And with every passing hour, the distance between Ethan's hidden past and his uncertain future continued to shrink. The second stage of the competition carried a different atmosphere from qualifying. The jokes were gone now. The easy smiles had disappeared. What remained was tension. Real competitors had begun paying attention, and attention is often the first sign of respect. By mid-morning, the grandstands were packed. The Montana sky stretched endlessly overhead, bright and clear, while a cool breeze swept across the speedway. Vendors shouted from concession stands. Children waved racing flags. Commentators filled the loudspeakers with predictions and statistics. Yet beneath all the excitement, one question seemed to linger over the entire facility. How far could Ethan Walker actually go? In the paddock, mechanics rushed around expensive race cars making last-minute adjustments. Blake Harrington stood with his team, reviewing data on several monitors. His expression remained confident, but something had changed. He was watching Ethan now. Not constantly, not obviously, but often enough to notice. Nearby, Ethan sat quietly on a folding chair outside his trailer. A small notebook rested in his hands. He studied it while sipping coffee. There were no engineers surrounding him, no sponsors, no crew members carrying tablets. Just a father sitting alone before one of the biggest races of his life. Sophie approached carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches wrapped in paper. "You forgot to eat again," she said. Ethan accepted one with a grateful smile. "Good thing I have someone looking out for me." Sophie sat beside him. For a few moments they watched people moving through the paddock. Finally she spoke. "Everybody keeps staring at us." Ethan nodded. "That happens sometimes. Do you like it?" Ethan laughed softly. "Not particularly." Sophie smiled. "Me neither." Their conversation ended as an official approached. "Drivers to staging," he announced. The next round was about to begin. One by one, competitors moved toward their vehicles. The atmosphere tightened immediately. Engines awakened. Crowds leaned forward. Cameras shifted into position. Rachel Bennett stood near pit lane with a microphone in hand. But even she found herself forgetting the broadcast for a moment. She was watching Ethan. The closer he came to racing, the calmer he appeared. Most drivers became more anxious under pressure. Ethan seemed to move in the opposite direction, as if noise only pushed him deeper into silence. The race began. Cars exploded away from the starting line. The first laps unfolded exactly as experts predicted. Blake Harrington established an early lead. Several professional teams battled fiercely for position. The crowd roared with approval. Yet somewhere in the middle of the field, Ethan remained steady. He did not force risky moves. He did not chase attention. Lap after lap, he simply stayed within reach. Patient, controlled, waiting. Commentators began noticing, then discussing, then questioning. "The local mechanic is still hanging on," one remarked. "More than hanging on," another replied. "Look at those corner exits." Across the track, experienced drivers started noticing as well. Ethan's vehicle behaved differently. Not faster in every situation. Not overwhelmingly powerful. Just remarkably balanced. Every movement appeared efficient. Every decision deliberate. By the midpoint of the race, several competitors who had laughed days earlier now found themselves staring into their mirrors. The crowd felt the shift too. Conversations changed. Expectations changed. Even the energy inside the grandstands changed. Sophie sat frozen in her seat, unable to look away. Every lap seemed longer than the one before. Every turn felt important. She barely breathed whenever Ethan disappeared behind a distant section of the circuit. Beside her, Rachel noticed tears gathering in the corners of the girl's eyes. Not from fear, from hope. Hope can be heavier than doubt when it matters enough. In the VIP suite, Victoria Sterling stood once again near the glass overlooking the track. Her executives continued discussing sponsorship numbers and media coverage, but she was no longer listening. Her attention belonged entirely to the race. More specifically, to one driver. At first, she had been curious about the machine. Now she found herself curious about the man. There was a difference. Machines reveal engineering. People reveal character. And every lap seemed to reveal another layer of Ethan Walker that did not fit the story she had assumed. Then something unexpected happened. During a brief caution period, timing data flashed across several monitors throughout the facility. Most spectators ignored it. Most reporters overlooked it. But Victoria's eyes locked onto a specific column of numbers. She stepped closer. Read them again. Then a third time. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. One of her executives noticed. Everything okay? Victoria remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. Who taught him to drive like that? It was the first time anyone had heard uncertainty in her voice. Outside, the caution period ended. Engines surged back to life. The field accelerated toward the next phase of the race. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Ahead of him stretched several more laps. Behind him lingered years of sacrifice, unanswered questions, and promises not yet fulfilled. And somewhere beyond the roar of engines and cheering crowds, the truth about who he really was continued moving closer, one lap at a time. The race entered its final stage beneath an atmosphere that felt completely different from the morning. Hours earlier, spectators had arrived expecting entertainment. Now they were witnessing something they could not quite explain. The giant screens around the speedway continuously updated positions and lap times, and every update seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding Ethan Walker. He was still there, still competing, still refusing to fade away. Lap after lap, the old car remained among machines that cost 10 times more and were supported by teams 20 times larger. The crowd no longer laughed when his name appeared on the leaderboard. They watched in silence. The kind of silence that arrives when certainty begins to disappear. In the grandstands, Sophie sat at the edge of her seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the faded baseball cap in her lap. Around her, thousands of strangers had become strangely invested in her father's journey. People who had mocked him online days earlier were now cheering whenever his position improved. Yet Sophie understood something none of them did. For her father, this had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had always been about something deeper, something he carried quietly, something he rarely spoke about. Beside her, Rachel Bennett continued taking notes, though she found herself writing less and observing more. Every story eventually reveals its heart. She had spent years covering races, championships, victories, and defeats. Yet this felt different. The emotional center of the story was not the competition. It was the man competing. Down in the paddock, tension spread among the professional teams. Engineers studied data. Drivers reviewed strategy. Crew chiefs exchanged worried looks. Blake Harrington remained in contention for the lead, but even he seemed increasingly distracted by Ethan's presence. During a brief stop between sessions, one of Blake's team members approached him. "We still have him covered." Blake nodded. "Do we?" The mechanic looked surprised. Blake stared toward Ethan's pit area. "Because if we do, I would like someone to explain how." No one answered. Across the facility, Victoria Sterling stood alone once more. The executives surrounding her had stopped discussing marketing opportunities. They had stopped discussing sponsorship metrics. Their attention had shifted entirely to the race unfolding before them. Victoria barely noticed them anymore. Her focus remained fixed on the timing data, on Ethan's driving, on the growing collection of unanswered questions. Earlier that afternoon, her research team had finally uncovered something. Not a complete answer, just a fragment. A clue buried beneath years of obscurity. The information sat inside a folder on the table behind her. She had read it twice already. Each time it left her more unsettled than before. Not because it revealed who Ethan was. It did not. It only proved that the version of him everyone saw today was not the complete story. Far from it. Meanwhile, Ethan remained inside the cockpit, focused entirely on the track ahead. The world beyond the windshield seemed distant. The crowd, the cameras, the speculation, none of it mattered in that moment. Yet memories continued surfacing between corners and straightaways. A workshop from years ago, a promise made during a difficult season of life, a voice he still carried with him. Every lap seemed to bring those memories closer. The old car responded beneath him with remarkable consistency. Every vibration felt familiar. Every sound carried meaning. It was no longer simply a machine. It was a bridge connecting past and present, a reminder of everything he had refused to abandon. Then, late in the afternoon, an unexpected announcement rippled through the speedway. Due to the structure of the event, only a handful of competitors would advance to the final showdown for the $6 million prize. The leaderboard flashed across every giant screen. Names appeared one by one. The crowd collectively held its breath. Blake Harrington qualified. Several elite teams qualified. Then another name appeared. Ethan Walker. For a moment, the entire facility seemed to freeze. Not because his advancement was impossible anymore, because it had become real. The local mechanic, the single father, the man with the rust-covered car everyone had dismissed. He was now one step away from the biggest race of the event. Sophie covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Rachel lowered her notebook completely. Even the commentators struggled to hide their amazement. Across the speedway, Victoria slowly opened the folder once again. Her eyes settled on a single photograph clipped inside. The image showed a much younger Ethan standing beside a vehicle years earlier. His expression carried a confidence she had never seen in the quiet mechanic. Victoria stared at the photograph. Then she looked toward the track. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she no longer wondered whether Ethan belonged in the competition. She wondered what had happened that made a man like that disappear. As evening shadows stretched across the speedway and preparations began for the final race, the emotional weight of the moment settled over everyone involved. Some were chasing victory. Some were chasing answers. And one man was moving steadily toward a destination he had been traveling toward for far longer than anyone realized. The sun hung low over the Montana horizon as the final race prepared to begin. Long shadows stretched across the speedway, painting the track in gold and amber. The air felt different now, quieter, heavier. Thousands of people filled the grandstands, yet an unusual stillness lingered beneath the noise. The story they had come to witness was no longer about prize money. It was no longer about sponsors, headlines, or predictions. It had become something far more human. Ethan Walker climbed into the cockpit one final time. His hands rested on the steering wheel that had carried him through years of work, sacrifice, and perseverance. Across the track, elite teams made their final adjustments. Blake Harrington stood beside his crew, focused and determined. Victoria Sterling watched from the VIP suite, the old photograph still resting inside the folder beside her. She knew more now than she had before. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that Ethan had once stood at the edge of greatness. Years earlier, before loss changed the course of his life, he had been one of the brightest young automotive designers in the country. The car everyone mocked was not simply an old project. It was the final prototype he had built alongside his late wife. A dream they had created together before life demanded something different from him. When she passed away, Ethan walked away from racing, away from recognition, away from ambition. He chose something quieter, raising Sophie, keeping promises, building a life measured not by trophies but by love. And now, years later, he had rebuilt that same machine with his own hands. Not to become famous, not to prove anyone wrong, but to honor a promise he had made long ago. The green flag dropped. The final race began. Cars surged forward. Engines thundered down the straightaway. The crowd erupted. Lap after lap, the competition unfolded with breathtaking intensity. Blake drove brilliantly. The professional teams performed exactly as champions should. Yet Ethan remained there. Calm, consistent, patient. Every movement carried purpose. Every corner reflected experience earned through years rather than months. Sophie watched from the stands with tears already gathering in her eyes. Rachel Bennett sat nearby, her notebook forgotten entirely. Victoria stood motionless against the glass. And somewhere during those final laps, something remarkable happened. The crowd stopped cheering for brands. They stopped cheering for sponsors. They started cheering for a father. With 3 laps remaining, Ethan moved into contention. With 2 laps remaining, he challenged for the lead. And on the final lap, beneath a sky painted by sunset, the old car carried him forward one last time. The finish line approached. Thousands rose to their feet. Hearts pounded. Breath caught in throats. Then it happened. Ethan crossed first. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The giant scoreboard displayed the result. The old car. The struggling single father. The impossible victory. Silence swept across the speedway. Not shock alone. Something deeper. Respect. The kind of silence that appears when people witness character revealed at exactly the right moment. Then the applause began. Slowly at first. Then everywhere. Thousands of people stood and clapped. Some cheered. Some wiped away tears. Others simply smiled. Ethan climbed from the car and looked toward the grandstands. Sophie was already running toward him. He met her halfway. She threw her arms around him and held on tightly. Neither said much. They did not need to. Some victories are too meaningful for words. Later, during the award ceremony, Victoria's Sterling stepped onto the stage beside him. Cameras flashed. Reporters waited. The crowd grew quiet again. Victoria looked at Ethan for several seconds before speaking. I laughed at something I did not understand. Her voice carried across the speedway, and I judged someone before I knew his story. Ethan said nothing. He simply listened. Victoria smiled softly. Congratulations, Ethan. Not just for winning the race, for reminding all of us what real success looks like. The crowd applauded once more. Ethan accepted the trophy, but his eyes drifted toward Sophie, toward the little girl who believed in him before anyone else did, toward the reason he had never given up. As darkness settled over the Montana hills and the last of the spectators began heading home, Ethan stood quietly beside the old car. The promise had finally been kept, not through pride, not through revenge, but through perseverance, grace, and love. Sometimes the strongest people are not the loudest. Sometimes the most extraordinary victories belong to those who never stop doing the ordinary things with dignity. And if this story touched your heart, perhaps take a moment to share where you are watching from and tell us what part stayed with you the most. Stories like Ethan's remind us that second chances are real, quiet strength matters, and sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very ones worth remembering. If you believe in that kind of hope, we would be honored to have you join us again for another story.